Hello. Well, that was a great story. What an amazing act that these guys were able to pull off, and makes you so proud to be from Boston. I'm going to talk about something that we think about coming from Boston, but moving outward, and that's really how to scale innovation. Just work here. One sec. So if you think about this, I wanted to really start with a quote. And this quote, I think, really speaks to many people in this room who are involved in innovation. And if you think about what William Gibson is saying here, is that basically anything that's going to be on scale in the next 3 to 5 years is already somewhere. It's in a laboratory, it's in a university, it's in someone's head, it's somewhere. It already exists. And in many ways, our job is to go and to find it, to bring it into our organizations, and to figure out how to scale it. And to do that, I'm going to talk about an approach we have for finding those edges, bringing them in, and then scaling them. And if you start with the history of Fidelity, Fidelity began as a startup just a few blocks from here in 1946. And our current chairman's father started the firm. But even back then, thinking about innovation was part of the DNA of the firm. So this is our history wall we have at FCAT, and it represents 3 different ways that we've tried to innovate. One is around customer experience. Second is around asset management and creating investment products. And the third is around technology. So if you look through the decades, you can see that in all of these time frames, we've really been thinking about how do we push the envelope. So 20, 30 years ago, that meant how do you have the first 800 number? In the mid-90s, it meant something like how do you have the first website? And 5 years ago, it might be the first iPhone app in the industry. I'm going to talk about some other themes we're pursuing now, but the idea is that in each of these realms, you're constantly pushing forward. So a lot of times people look at innovation in a short time frame and say, what about mobile and social and cloud? But many of these things are part of a longer arc. So what I thought I'd do is really take us back to our first computer.
The year 1965 finds Fidelity buying its first mainframe computer. A special air-conditioned environment is built for it, spanning the entire 3rd floor of 82 Devonshire. It is the most advanced computing machine available. Today, you could do the same computing and more on a mere desktop.
So really, the computer was the technique to be able to go through, reach our customers, keep track of the information that we have to successfully process their accounts.
In an instant, the Fidelity world changes. For the first time, the company has the information infrastructure to do what only banks could do before: accept payments, handle transactions, deal with transfer functions. This new technology doesn't just make managing information easier, it completely changes the relationship with our customers. From distant to direct, in a single instant, events were put in motion that couldn't be stopped. It was the beginning of a technological revolution. Ultimately, this new technology would lead to even bigger things. First, the establishment of Fidelity Service Company, and eventually to the creation of Fidelity Investment Systems Company.
So for many of you who are fans of Mad Men, you'll recognize the haircuts and the suits from the 60s, but a very different approach. And the idea was, even though we were a money manager at that point in time, how was it that we were going to use new technology to really innovate around customer experience? Back then, it was a computer the size of the floor of an office building, but that changes over time. And so we have to keep in mind that even in this long arc of history, there kind of has to be a true north. There has to be something that we're innovating towards. And so innovation without strategy is just novelty, and oftentimes it's gratuitous and has no kind of life kind of to it, because it doesn't really make a difference in a customer's lives. So when we look at innovating, particularly in emerging technology, we ask ourselves 3 questions. Is it going to help us create a better customer experience? Is it going to help us create better investment outcomes? Is it going to help us be more scalable, more flexible, more cost effective? If the answer is no, then it's not of interest to us. So this is really kind of the true north when we go out and look at emerging technology. This is the first screen that we really impose on it. So FCAT was created in the late 90s. The idea was Fidelity is a company of over 40,000 people distributed around the world, but could we create a group that was responsible for catalyzing innovation? And what I mean by catalyzing is really bringing in ideas and spreading them throughout the organization, bringing in new techniques, bringing in new ways of doing business, and creating a platform for people within Fidelity who wanted to innovate to have a place to go, a place to get resources, a place to work with other like-minded individuals. So when we think about going beyond the edge, first you have to define the edge. And for many of us, our edge is pretty clear. It's our existing markets, our existing products, our existing capabilities. And that seems fairly obvious, but if you think about that, many people spend their whole lives in that. The markets they serve are the markets they continue to serve. The products they have a life cycle, and they continue to try to increment it to extend that life cycle. The capabilities that got them to where they are the capabilities that they continue to invest in. And that works for a period of time, and sometimes for a very long time. But at some point, you need new markets, you need new products, and you need new capabilities. So the question is, how do you get there? How do you find those new markets? How do you acquire new capabilities? How do you develop new products? So we have a couple different ways that we try to approach that. The first is really to look at it kind of in a thematic way. So if you think about a few years ago, in this core, that today you see things like social and mobile, cloud and big data. But 5 years ago, those would have been on the edge. Those would have been things that were new, that were not yet part of our core. But today, millions of Fidelity investors use iPhones and Android phones to manage their investments. Many of them are fans of ours on Facebook and follow us on Twitter or work with us on LinkedIn. So those things have gone from being on the edge to being now part of the core. But there are new edges. So if you look at things like gamification or predictive analytics or artificial intelligence or robotics and automation or things like pervasive video, these are new edges, things that are not yet part of our core, but things that we're exploring. So one of them that is of great interest to us is evolving interfaces, sometimes talked about as wearable computing. So I'm going to show an example of something we launched in the fall, not so much as a product, but really to start a conversation about how might computing evolve if you wore it, as an example, on your face.
I was born on a Tuesday in Detroit. News.
It's all about the labor market today. Let's kick off with Friday morning.
Quotes. A logo. Markets.
So many of you recognize South Station there, and this may or may not happen in the future, but the idea is how do we start a conversation with consumers about what they want to see in something like Google Glass or other forms of wearable computing. And so to put something out there, we also have an app that people who are part of the Google Glass community can use. But the goal here is to say, does this make sense? Does this resonate with you? Is this an edge that's right, or is this an edge too far? The other way to really look at for edges is geographically. So Fidelity and FCAT are headquartered in Boston, and obviously Boston is the hub of the universe, and there are many, many ideas that emanate from Boston. But there are also places around the world that also have great ideas that we need to be looking for very proactively, with a presence in all these geographies where ideas are happening and where there's things that we think could be of value to our customers. So in North Carolina, we have a big presence in the Research Triangle. North Carolina has really become the home of big data, many things going on there that really help us do a better job of understanding information and making it valuable for our users. We have an office in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Obviously, when you even look globally, Silicon Valley continues to lead the world in innovation around social, around mobile, around many of the big themes that matter to our customers. And when you go around the globe into China, we have an R&D operation in Dalian, China that's focused really on understanding what's happening in Asia, which in many ways is similar to the United States, but there are key differences, particularly around the use of mobile and the pervasiveness of it. In many ways, they kind of skipped the kind of computer generation and went right to mobile, and the mobile is really a way of life in some ways. We have an R&D operation in Bangalore, really focused on how to innovate around software development, how to really take things to the next level in terms of getting a lot of information and turning it into valuable data. And then finally, we have an operation in Dublin that's focused on Europe, which, despite some of the economic problems there, has really become a hotbed of innovation in Dublin, in London, in Stockholm, in Berlin. Each of these markets represents unique ideas, it represents great capabilities, represents ways that we should really be thinking about, does that future already exist there that we should be finding and pulling back into the United States and trying to figure out how we scale it. And then it all leads back to Boston. So the next way we look at it is really within the ecosystem, and David Chang talked about the innovation ecosystem. I'm only going to focus on a couple nodes of this here, but I think more and more there's an understanding that cities in particular represent ecosystems of various capabilities. So here we have universities, but we also have venture capitalists, we have startups, we have our own employees, we have government agencies, we have a variety of people who are all thinking about the same issues we're thinking about, but often from a very different angle. So in terms of academic institutions, we have a very robust partnership with the MIT Media Lab, with Stanford University's D School. And the goal here is really to say, are there ideas that people are working on in academia that really are part of the future and need to be taken from academia into commerce and scaled? When you look at something like Mass Challenge, right over the block here, I mean, we've been a sponsor of Mass Challenge for the last few years and have met dozens of startups that have pushed our thinkings and several startups that we're actually doing pilots with. So, you know, again, it's very easy for people to sit in their office and wait for ideas to come to them. It's a little more challenging to deal with 128 startups at a Mass Challenge, but the rewards are there for those that are willing to go out and really seek them. So when you look at, now you've found some ideas, but how do you actually bring them into an organization? Fidelity, 42,000 employees, operations all over the world. It's not so easy. If you're at a startup, it's kind of easy. Someone goes to a conference, comes back with a great idea, can kind of tell everyone about it. That's what Fidelity used to be. Now we're at a different scale. So how is it that you do that? So what we try to do is really bring the best and the brightest onto Fidelity's premises. So over at the World Trade Center at our office at 245, and have them do seminars that we then broadcast around the world. So again, they're in line with the themes that I talked about earlier. So you can see themes on social media, on cloud, on mobile, on wearable computing. And the goal here is really to inspire and inform our employees. So many of them, you know, very passionate about these topics, and how do we make it easy for them to hear from the best people in the world? Part of that is what we do ourselves. Danielle Duplin, who runs that area, is here in the crowd. But at the same time, we also partner with other people. So we partner with a MyTex or with an Xconomy or with the Blogwell and in the social media space to say, bring us your experts, bring them to talk to our employees, help them to understand what you're doing and how it might apply to their jobs. The next way we really try to do that is through experiential learning. And this takes many forms. So we do hackathons where we invite people to come for 2 or 3 days, bring their ideas. We'll give them resources like developers and prototypers and designers to really take what's just an idea maybe, or maybe a PowerPoint sitting in their desk and say, can you create something real that people can touch and feel? Can we really take something that is a nice idea, but no one can really understand whether it's got value, and create something that we can really take to customers and say, does this resonate with you? The other way we try to do it is things like sponsoring TEDxBoston or holding unconferences. And again, the goal here is to really have a diversity of thinking. You know, many of us spend most of our days talking with our colleagues about our specific business issues. And that's great, and that's how work gets done, and that makes a lot of sense. At the same time, how do you take a step back? So here's an example on stage here of Geraldine Hamilton over at the Weiss Institute talking about how they have the diversity of engineering and biotech to try to create new ways to put, in this case, an organ on a chip. So that type of interdisciplinary thinking is important. We may have people from our organization who are at that and say, that's really interesting, I hadn't thought about how to combine 2 different fields like that. What is the kind of implication for our business? And so, I think learning about your own craft is super important. At the same time, it's very important that you're bringing in diverse sets of ideas, particularly from industries you spend no time with, because those are oftentimes the things that are going to be most powerful in terms of making you think differently. And then another way we do this is with our partnership with Stanford University. So we've been sponsors and working with the D School since 2006, and design thinking is kind of a more popular notion now, but for us it's really about the best way to really create products and services that resonate with customers is to develop them with those customers. And the essence of design thinking is really to fall in love with the problem. Many of us who work in companies fall in love with our solutions. We have a product, we love it, we want to scale it. But what this forces you to do is to take a step back and say, is this really solving a problem that someone actually has? And so we utilize this technique to really bring customers in literally day one. Someone has an idea, rather than spending 6 months doing a bunch of business cases and PowerPoint decks. Say, let's bring in customers, let's create paper prototypes and see, is there really even a problem here? Then let's test and iterate, and let's do that loop. And in some ways, we're looking for what's on the right side of the screen there is really, a lot of times we can figure out things that we think are financially viable. They have a business model. They're probably technologically feasible, but are they desirable? Do they really make a difference in people's lives? Does anyone really want them? That's it. It sounds like a trivial challenge, but if you look at most of the new products that fail, it's not because they didn't deliver on what they said they would, or it's not because they couldn't figure out how to make money. It's because they really weren't that compelling, and people really didn't adopt them in a way that the people who built them thought they were going to. We also try to look outside our industry. So this is an example of a problem-solving session we did with Jetblue. I mean, Jetblue is in a service industry, we're in a service industry, but they think about things very differently than we do. So some of our folks spent a day at Logan working with Jetblue to say, if we were trying to think about how to help you with your experience, what would you do? And similarly, they did the same for us. And so again, this idea of trying to bring other ideas in to your process, different perspectives, in a fairly kind of robust way, not just have a meeting, but really sit down and work with people to say, can we prototype a different experience based on how you would approach it versus how we would approach it? And then once you get these ideas, you have to scale them. I mean, we're a large business. We manage about $4.7 trillion in assets now. It really, for something to make a difference, it has to inevitably get big. It has to go beyond an idea in a lab to a prototype to a pilot. It has to be something that really gets out there. And so when we look at that, we start by really starting with a lean startup process. So this is one of our labs over at 245 Summer, and this is where we really begin to incubate ideas. So we take lean startup methodology, and that idea that someone may have come up with, or we may have gotten from a partner or from an academic institution, we begin to prototype it and we begin to build it. We then bring people into what we call the think space, and that's where we really get feedback from these customers. So we build something. Now the question is, does it matter? Does anyone care? Does it solve a problem they actually have in a way that's compelling? So that's where we bring customers in right now and say, you know what, we've got this idea. We think this could make a difference for you. And again, it's a very humbling process. You can imagine most people who, when they come up with an idea or a product idea, you know, they're in love with it. They think it's great. And to have someone come and say, I don't even get why I would do that at all, it is humbling, but it's better to know that now when we spent a week on it than after a multi-million-dollar launch, 2 years later. And so the real goal, I mean, fail fast is kind of one of these overused phrases. I would like to substitute learn fast. Learn fast, learn cheaply, and learn in a way that once you learn it, you just didn't learn it didn't work. You learn what might work instead. How do you take that idea? How do you pivot it? How do you change it so that it will resonate with customers? And then what we try to do is then take some of these ideas, and we have our own internal idea management platform, and say, okay, we've got this idea. It's resonated with a bunch of folks. How can you help us to build on it and make it better? How can you help us think about this? So this is kind of our social platform for continuing to improve ideas. Sometimes new ideas come from this. Sometimes it's more of an iterative process. But the goal is that we try to solicit as much input as quickly as possible, similar to the video I showed you for Google Glass, where by putting that out there, some people are like, this is ridiculous. I would probably end up walking into my neighbor and tripping over them. Why would you even do this? That's great. It's probably not for you. But other people would say, wow, that's really interesting. I had never thought about really being able to consume information in that way. And so this is a forum we use to try to solicit those edge points of view, both for and against, and to try to understand, what do people think about when they get these. And then we created something in 2005 called Fidelity Labs. And this is an opportunity for us to put out things that aren't quite yet ready for prime time, but we think are good enough that they can give people feedback. So in this case, we would take something like the Google Glass. I'll show you a game we created in a minute. And something that we would really say, you know what, we think there's an idea here. It's good enough for you to use for real, and we'd like your feedback on it. And that feedback phase is what we use to improve it. Because if we're going to put something onto Fidelity.com, or we're going to put something out in production, it's going to have to be bulletproof. It's going to have to be industrial strength. I mean, we're dealing with people's money. We're dealing with their retirement. So there's no room for error there. This is the time to really polish it, to get the feedback, to refine it. So one example is a game. And to Ben's point from Google, we're not trying to compete with Xbox here. The goal is, what we're trying to do is reframe education. So we have a lot of millennials who are our 401k participants or our young investors. And they told us, I'm not going to read a white paper on diversification. I'm not interested in looking at a video about asset allocation. I find those things to be extremely painful. But are there other ways we can engage them? So this is a game that kind of takes those concepts around asset allocation, around diversification, and turns it into a game where you can try to beat the benchmark, essentially, try to figure out how you can become a better investor. And so it's never going to be at the bestseller at GameStop. That's not its intent. Its intent is to reframe content in a way that's more approachable, more interesting, and more engaging to some of our audiences. So how does this then get to full scale? So this, I'm going to show you a video in a moment, but how this started was we went out to Stanford and engaged the Stanford fellows and said, how do we really get people thinking about retirement savings? It's actually one of the toughest problems, right? It's a long-term problem. I really don't have to think about it today. There's no urgency to it. It's kind of painful. You know, I got to give up money now to get something later. It's got a lot of complexity to it. There's a lot of products to choose from. There's a lot of planning tools. And really, I've got day-to-day needs that are more pressing. I mean, I'm more worried about shorter-term goals than I am about retirement. So if you're looking at it from a behavioral economics perspective, it's got some real challenges. And part of what we've learned by going out to folks who are, you know, recent college graduates or still in school was the problem had been made too abstract. It was like, what is my number when I'm 65? Well, guess what? I'm 22. I could care less. Or, you know, I really can't even think that far. I don't even know if I'm going to have a job in 3 years. What am I worrying about retirement? And so the real goal is to say, how do you take that feedback to say, because again, we think about this very seriously and like this is the best way to think about this. These planning tools are been honed by people who have PhDs and thinking about this stuff. And that in many ways is the way that the people who really want to engage want to get delivered information. But we also want to say, could we deliver a more simplified way of approaching this that was more accessible, that helped people to think about it in a rougher way, to kind of engage them so that then once they got to that, could they go beyond that? And I'll show you how this showed up on MSNBC.
Well, if you don't have a hoard of gold stashed away in your home, how much do you need to start saving to retire comfortably? Well, Fidelity Investment's out with some new guidelines. It is based on age benchmarks. They say this: by the time you're 35, you should have at least 1 full year's salary saved up. By 45, 3 times your annual average salary. By 55, 5 times. And by the age of 67, Fidelity says you should have 8 times your yearly income saved for retirement. But are these targets too aggressive? They seem it. And is anybody even close to hitting them? Let us bring in Jeannie Thompson. She is Vice President of Market Insights at Fidelity. She helped craft these goals. And I, for one, Jeannie, this weekend I'm going to start a lawn mowing business because I am nowhere near being close to this. Are these targets too aggressive?
Good afternoon, Kevin. Well, we believe that these targets are achievable, and the reason that we set the targets by age is to make them more achievable. To tell someone who's 35 that they need to save $500,000 can be overwhelming, but breaking it down, so when you're 35, you only need to save 1 times your income, and if you're making $40,000, $40,000 would be your target. We believe that that's a bit more achievable, and it's an easy math calculation for folks to do. Sometimes people get overwhelmed by the large numbers, so this breaks it down and makes it simpler.
So that's how something that started as a challenge to some students at Stanford ends up with a new way of simplifying how people think about retirement. Now, in some ways it may be oversimplified, but that's okay, because the goal here, no one's going to say, you know what, I saw that news clip and I did my entire retirement plan off of it, I hope. I mean, it's more to say, you should begin to think about this in a way that's more meeting you where you are. And the goal over time then is to engage them in their retirement. It's not our retirement, it's their retirement. But if we, as we did sometimes in the past, if we lay out a challenge that's very, very long-term and seems kind of scary, some people are not going to respond to that. And so the goal is, how do you meet people where they are? And you do that by finding those customers and having them help you to give you ideas. So that idea emanated directly from students at Stanford who said, you have to help me understand what I need to do now, not what I need to do when I'm 65. So I would leave you with this thought that, Alan Kay, who was the head of Xerox PARC, which is a fountain of amazing innovation over the years, said that really there's not a lot of value to be gained in predicting the future. It's very hard to know. The best way to do is invent it. And our experience is the best way to invent it is to determine the edge of your business, figure out ways that you can go and find things beyond those edges, whether it's thematically, whether it's through looking at different geographies, whether it's looking through different techniques. Then figure out ways to bring those edges back into your organization and make sure they're widely disseminated. You may have a core group of people who are responsible for that, but you want your entire organization to be engaged in innovation. You want everyone to be thinking about, how do I do a better job? How do I apply these emerging technologies? And then lastly, how do you think about taking something from a classroom in Palo Alto to scale, where in our case, we're 20 million 401k participants now can have a simplified model to think about retirement savings that will probably engage them even more deeply in what's going to be probably the biggest financial transaction of their life as they begin to prepare for retirement. So, and that leads you to the opportunity to invent new things in your category. And so Fidelity has a long tradition of really looking at emerging technology to try to improve customer experience, create better investment outcomes in a way that's scalable, flexible, and cost-effective. And that's kind of our story. And thank you very much to the Ad Club for letting me share it.